So the second of the projects we're going to look at actually, I think, came together at last year's ASHG in Boston. It was an existing project brought forward by people working in the field. And so the role of the Global Alliance was then to say, how can we support, how can we collaborate something that's already been initiated? And as many of our things for the last year have done, it involved Heidi Rehm. And so to talk about that, take us through Matchmaker, Heidi.
Thanks, Peter. So it's a pleasure to talk about this project. It did originate 1 year ago at this meeting. A bunch of us, Kim Boycott and I, gathered a lot of people we knew were working in the space to really try to come up with a global solution. So what is the problem that we're talking about for those of you who haven't been in the know on the concept of genomic matchmaking? So this is just a slide that sort of illustrates the concept. Here we're talking about scenarios where patients are being sequenced by exome or genome sequencing. They have a series of phenotypic features. Does the laser pointer work on here? There we go. That may be overlapping with other patients, and candidate genes are identified without enough evidence for causality. And so you're left in this sort of ambiguous state of, well, I've got a really interesting candidate gene, a de novo variant or something, but not enough evidence to really implicate that gene and give a result back to a patient that can be acted upon. So how can we improve this? How can we create ways to bring cases with overlapping phenotype features and overlapping sets of candidate genes together to mount enough evidence to actually return useful results to patients? So these are a lot of the groups that have come together that have databases that support the collection of both phenotypic and genotypic information that are actually doing matchmaking within their systems, but we all recognize that the power of that matchmaking could be hugely enhanced by connecting all of these databases. And just recently, we've started bringing in the concept of patient-to-patient matchmaking being done by patients themselves. And so I'll talk about each of these groups and what we're working on. And the first part of this to really integrate these different databases was to develop an API, and both the two of the groups, Phenome Central, led by Mike Brudno, and the Gene Matcher System by Ada Hamash, have been already had developed an API, and that formed the basis of developing this interface that we could implement between the systems. There's been a lot of work put into a reasonably simple and straightforward set of fields that could be exchanged to help support this process. And I'm not going to get into the details of the API, but in terms of conceptually, what are you doing when you're doing matchmaking? These are sort of the steps that also outline some of the policy decisions that we've been making on conference calls over the last year. We've been working on this project. So the first step is a submitter deposits a case, and I put that term in red because there actually has been some active discussion in our group about, do you require deposition of data in order to execute a query of a system to see if you find a match? And I would say the majority, not all, are fully supportive of the requirement of deposition, because if you don't get a match, you want that case there for the next search that comes along, and really incentivizing the building of databases that can support identifying commonalities. So the hope here is that the submitter will deposit the case with at least a gene candidate and or a disease name or high-level HPO term, and that could be done without consent, and this is currently a proposal on the consent end, I'll talk about in a second, or detailed HPO terms for detailed phenotype, and the submitter enters their identity. And that was also a point of debate. Should we make people identify themselves when they do queries? And the answer that we all agreed upon was yes, you need to identify yourself if you're acting within this system. Then you execute the query, and the query would then reach out not only to the database that you entered the data in, but through the API to all the other databases. And if a match occurs, both the depositor and the requester would be notified at the same time, allowing the engagement of those two groups. Now, just simply an electronic match does not thereby create evidence. It then requires those two groups to get together, share the details of their cases and the evidence they have, and decide if that is actually a valid match and creates enough evidence, or more work is needed, or no, that's really not, that was a spurious match. So this is sort of the principles upon which we are, operating or working to operate this system. Now, one of the great things about bringing this project fairly quickly into the Developing Global Alliance was that we really benefited from working with the different working groups and bringing questions to those groups to gather the expertise of those groups. So, for example, the API that was developed was shared with the data working group, reviewed by them, and a lot of good feedback has happened with that exchange. In fact, there's been changes and efforts are underway to really enhance and ensure that that API is consistent with other formats and file specifications. So that's an active process that's going on right now. We've also engaged the Regulatory and Ethics Working Group to share a proposal we came up with on consent, what wouldn't be required in order to execute matches and what would be required in terms of data deposition. A task force is being formed within the Regulatory and Ethics Work Group to really work with us on this issue and define exactly what amount of consent is needed for what types of matching. We are about to reach out to the security working group. Obviously, there's major implications in terms of securing patient data and the authentication of queries that will be critical in addressing in each of these databases to ensure that we are protecting patients in this process. And then the clinical working group, actually a lot of us in this project are already in the clinical working group. And there haven't been specific tasks for that group other than keeping us all in the same page. But I do think that engaging the phenotype will be critical as these databases grow, and we need to enhance the specificity of matching and how we think about those activities. Moving on. There we go. So I did ask each of the groups to highlight in their systems the actual matching that has already occurred, because I want to make sure people know that this is not a new concept, it's happening. So in Phenome Central, there's already been 2 validated matches from their data set that's been entered in Gene Matcher. In some of these, they track validation of the matches. Others, Ada in her system has been tracking the number of electronic matches that have happened. Sorry, we're having issues with advancing. And they don't have a way to know how many have been validated. Try this one more time. But knowing the number of matches that have occurred is actually important to understand the specificity of matching. If there were 668 matches in 668 cases, there's probably a problem. So, how these algorithms work in terms of creating matches is also important to this process and will be a subject of ongoing development. The Decipher Database is part of this project. They have an enormous collection of data that has already resulted in over 600 publications from matchmaking within their system, and they're working on implementing the API to expose their data through the Genomic Matchmaker project. GEMApp is another group led by Stephen Zuckner. Thousands of cases into their database. They've already had 34 publications in the last 2 years. Okay, I'm clearly having issues with this advancing. So that's been a successful project. Again, now working to implement the API and link it up to the system. Cafe Variome project led by Tony Brooks in the UK. They are just launching this system. It's being tested in 6 different sites to enable matching and other activities and data sharing between groups. We are working with the clinic on the clinical genome resource. Our main project right now is actually setting up an environment to manage bulk submissions to dbGaP on behalf of clinical and research labs, and allowing controlled access to individual genotype and phenotype data. But through supporting those activities, we will also be able to support matchmaking within those data sets, and also supporting the patient registry that we're developing. And then so the Undiagnosed Diseases Network is a new initiative by NIH, actually based upon a longstanding initiative at NIH, the Undiagnosed Diseases Program. But this has now been dramatically expanded in the last 6 months to a year to many other sites. They don't have a system yet to support this, but although a lot of the UDP data, I think, has gone into Phenome Central. But we're working closely with them to ensure that the infrastructure they develop to support the UDN project will be consistent with the Genomic Matchmaker project that we have underway. And then the LOVD system, which has historically been a database supporting variant databases, has launched a mechanism to be able to highlight variants that are put out there as potential candidates. And they've already had, one publication that resulted from this VIP status of variants. Although more challenging to think about implementation of the matchmaking algorithm because of the different sort of focus of that database, but we're actively engaged with Johan and others in that group to think about engaging the LOVID database system. And then in working with the regulatory and ethics work group, Sharon Terry sits on that group and brought up the fact that this patient registry concept of doing matchmaking with patient-to-patient interaction. And in fact, in their system, there is the ability for the patients to designate that they want to be connected with others with similar phenotypes and genotypes. And that is, in essence, matchmaking. So we're now, on our working group on Tuesday, going to really start to explore this concept of patient-to-patient matchmaking and how we think about it in the context of this larger project. Forward. And just last night, we launched our website, www.matchmakerexchange.org. Yeah, don't go to matchmaker.com. You'll get a whole different activity. Maybe more interesting. So this is our brand new website. It's fairly simple and straightforward right now. It'll be the basis upon which we start to communicate with the community and share what we are up to. And most of the group hasn't yet seen this website yet, but you can go there now and explore it. So the last slide, what are we doing right now? Whoops, go back one. So the activities we have underway are to continue working with the Global Alliance work groups to finalize the API specifications, agree on the consent policies, and address the security requirements. Also working with each of the Matchmaker Exchange databases to implement the API or address and identify any barriers to implementation that we have to work on to really make this project become real. And then develop guidance. So there's a lot of people who have data that aren't in any of these databases. Now, the next part of this is also to help give guidance to groups who are trying to figure out where to put their data so that it can be utilized in this Matchmaker Exchange environment, and trying to come up with ways to give appropriate guidance to tell them which group to work with based on their needs and their requirements. So that those are the sort of major areas of activity right now in moving this project forward. And of course, the last slide is really to acknowledge an enormous number of people that have been engaged in this project. It's been a lot of fun. And just to highlight a few of the people, Kim helping me sort of steer this ship, Anthony Philippakis doing a lot of work with leading the API working group and all the conversations we've had on the phone, and Danielle Meadowville and my group that's helping coordinate this project. So, and I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
So again, I would say that people who are heavily involved in matchmaking are going to have lots of time to talk about it. This is the opportunity for people who this is new or it's highly relevant to what they're doing to get that message across to Heidi. No takers. You'll be around for not just this meeting, but for the rest of the time. And I know from some conversations with some people who are not coming to the microphone that this is really relevant to what they're doing, and this move into patient-focused and patient disease group focus. So I'm hoping you can connect with some of those groups who are in the room. Okay, thank you.